And I first didn't really know why. And then I realized that I was weeping for this whole generation of beautiful young people and the future they were facing. And I was weeping for our Mother Earth. And soon after that, I heard about Extinction Rebellion taking 5 bridges in London and turning the national conversation from Brexit to climate change. So I joined in the nonviolent revolution in Vermont. Extinction Rebellion united with others, including 350.org and a migrant and environmental justice coalition with youth leading the way. With creative direct action, they brought the message of climate and ecological emergency to the chamber of the Vermont State House and got a lot of people talking about it. You can see that's me with David Zuckerman's daughter on the left with one of our draft horses at the youth encampment. But it is a challenge to be a farmer and an activist. At the time, I was gravitated to the role of advocate. I know as time went by, I gravitated more towards the role of an advocate for soil. This shift was complete when I met the Australian climate scientist and soil microbiologist Walter Yenny, from whom I first heard about the concept of the soil carbon sponge and its ability to naturally and safely cool the planet. Walter's message changed my life and landed me back on my own 2 feet and the soil beneath them. Before, I was rebelling out of a sense of desperation, but now the solutions seemed within reach. I'll explain what I learned from Walter and many others besides as we go through the talk, but I want to start out with how we arrived at our current situation, our current moment of this agribiz apocalypse. So Tropical Storm Irene came as a wake-up call to all Vermonters. A lot of soil washed away with Irene. Farmers everywhere are on the front line of climate change. The Northeast is 20% wetter since 1970. Climate scientists predict it will be 20% wetter again by 2050. Our crops and our cattle are under stresses of extreme heat, drought, and precipitation events. We see new insects and plant diseases every year. Bats and swallows are missing from the sky. We experience unpredictable growing seasons. USDA has reclassified our region from Zone 3 to Zone 4. In the middle of the country in the spring of 2019, the Mississippi, Arkansas, and Missouri rivers all flooded. 20 million acres went unplanted. 20 billion was lost in profits. That same summer, 2.5 million acres of forest burned in Alaska. Georgia and North Carolina suffered drought and record-breaking heat. Worldwide, it was the hottest year in the history of humanity. In 2019, climate catastrophes around the planet dominated the news cycle. At current rates of soil degradation, groundwater depletion, and salinization, the Central Valley of California, where 40% of our produce is produced, will be a desert in 10 years. Globally, 30% of all arable land has been abandoned over the last 40 years. 25 million acres are abandoned each year. The FAO, the UN, predicts that at current rates of worldwide soil loss, we have 60 harvests left. Dust storms have returned to the high plains. The last 3 years have witnessed scenes reminiscent of 1935. California now burns out of control during the rainy season. This past year, the Amazon in Australia experienced unprecedented wildfire holocausts. We know that famine played a major role in the uprisings of the Arab Spring that led to the Syrian civil war. How many years before we face multiple breadbasket failures around the world? Social scientists tell us that civil order turns to rioting after 7 missed meals. The UN predicts that as many as 700 million climate refugees could be on the move by 2050. People of the global south who have contributed the least and suffered the worst from what Bill McKibben calls the iron law of climate change. Our response must be to receive these people and offer them full and fair opportunity to contribute to our society. The farmers among them should be given access to land. This process of land degradation was set in motion 10,000 years ago when we made the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists. Since then, humans have degraded half of the terrestrial land surface. Here in Vermont, land degradation began with European settlers 2 centuries ago. The invention of the machine loom, followed by the introduction of merino sheep, touched off a boom and bust in the wool industry. 80% of the forest was cleared by the turn of the 20th century. The rivers ran brown with silt. Half of our soil was lost. And indeed, 1/3 of all atmospheric carbon released since 1750 has come from land degradation. Entire soil types are going extinct. We've removed animals from the land and placed them in confinement. Force-fed high soy and corn diets, they cannot survive in these environments without antibiotic-laced feed. Their manure becomes a waste management problem. Only humans create waste. In natural systems, nothing is wasted. We grow monocrops for animal feed and ethanol on land that was once short and long grass prairie, teeming with life. We burn fossil fuels to store and truck feed over long distances. Soil, once 10 feet deep, swiftly erodes away. Not only our soil, but our water is in trouble too. Eutrophication from unchecked urban runoff, sewage, detergents, and pharmaceuticals, along with the farm runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from large confinement dairies, have created annual algal blooms. Vermont dairy farms produce the same amount of milk now as they did in 1970. Back then we had 5,000 dairy farms. Today we have 650. Each year, 80,000 acres are planted to corn in Vermont. If all that corn was undersown in cover crop, it could sequester the carbon equivalent of removing 51,920 cars off Vermont roads. But that's just the beginning. Think of if we were to transition all of that land to regenerative practice. Bare soil is 10 times more prone to erosion than under cover crop, 10 to 100 times more prone to erosion than soil under pasture, 1,000 to 10,000 times more prone to erosion than soil under forest. Original prairies have 10% organic matter or more. Ag soils in the US typically are lower than 1%. In the US, on average, 4 tons of topsoil is lost from every ag acre every year. Out in Iowa, it's like 5.3 tons. That's 4 pickup trucks leaving every acre every year. The overall economic loss is valued at $37 billion. Degraded soils require chemical fertilizers and pesticides to prop them up. These products are repurposed munitions and toxic agents from the world wars of the 20th century. These biocides kill the soil microbiology and make crops dependent upon synthetic intervention. Cover crops and no-till are an improvement, but planted in monocrops, they lack biodiversity. Conventional no-till relies on GMO seed and glyphosate, which is classified a human carcinogen by the EU, the most used pesticide on the planet right now. Pollinator-killing nicotinoids and soil-killing chemical fertilizers and pesticides grow sick plants and animals, and that makes for sick people. So what is to be done? Vermont lawmakers put forth some progressive legislation in the 2020 session, the Multi-State Transportation Climate Initiative, Vermont Green New Deal, and they recently passed legally binding targets to lower greenhouse gas emissions. So transportation, weatherization, wind, solar, and hydro are all technological fixes. This is Hydro-Quebec. That's the sustainable power we rely on right there, Canada's national sacrifice region. So we know we have to lower greenhouse emissions through technological means. By any means possible, we have to transition off of fossil fuels, no doubt about it. But in a rural state like Vermont, I think we aren't looking in all the right places for the solutions we need. If it rained 8 to 11 inches in a 12-hour period, the way it did during Tropical Storm Irene, back in 1800, the old growth forests of our region would have infiltrated that water with ease. No catastrophic flooding of our waterways. The people who lived in the forest and saw it as a food forest, the Abenaki people would have thought, big rain, no problem. For every increase of 1% organic matter, a well-aggregated soil holds 20,000 to 27,000 gallons of water per acre. Soil is the key to surviving and even thriving in an era of abrupt climate change. The last 25 years have seen an explosion of new discoveries about the soil microbiome, particularly the role of fungi in regulating soil processes. We organic farmers used to think that humus formation was solely the product of decomposition. We're now beginning to understand that photosynthesis grows soil through a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with microscopic soil flora and fauna. 30 to 70% of the liquid carbon sugars manufactured through photosynthesis by plants are delivered to the microbes living in the rhizosphere in the form of exudates. Countless billions of fungi, bacteria, beneficial nematodes, and protozoa thrive in this environment and deliver nutrients, minerals, and water to plant roots in exchange for carbon. And this is how humus is formed. Our current practices are largely degenerative, and most of our incentives are misplaced. We need a just transition to shift our farms and forests over to regenerative land management. What would that look like? Here are some universal principles that we can follow to promote healthy soil in every context. Minimize bare soil to maximize photosynthesis to keep the liquid carbon pathway active at all times. Soil cover increases organic matter. Soil cover protects against erosion. Minimize disturbance. Tillage burns up carbon and destroys the soil microbiome. Organic no-till creates a sink for carbon that restores the natural fertility of soils. Maximize diversity. Plant diversity stimulates greater microbial life and increases biodiversity at all trophic levels. Keep animals in contact with the soil. Forage crops thrive under intensive management grazing. Planned grazing improves pasture and grows healthy livestock. Farmers and ranchers should receive training in regenerative practices. Dairy farmers should be incentivized to keep livestock at carrying capacity and get them back out on the land. On-farm and municipal composting can help put us back on track to a circular economy and a zero-waste society. Healthy soil can sequester 3 to 10 tons of carbon per acre. It has been estimated that if all 8.3 billion acres of rangeland and 3.8 billion acres of cropland on the planet were converted to regenerative land management, we could sequester enough carbon to bring CO2 in the atmosphere back down to 350 parts per million in just 5 years. But the benefits of regenerative agriculture go far beyond carbon sequestration. At 90% water vapor is the most prevalent greenhouse gas. CO2 is a mere 0.04%. 1 gram of soil carbon can hold 8 grams of water. We can restore the hydrologic cycle, restore the small rain cycles, cool the planet 1 microclimate at a time, mitigating both flood and drought while extending plant longevity. We know that every person owes their existence to soil, and the human gut biome depends on the health of the soil biome, just as the microorganisms in soil provide metabolites to plants. The microorganisms in our gut provide nutrition to our cells. Access to healthcare regularly polls as among the top concerns of Vermonters. If every citizen were dedicated to creating soil through the promotion of regenerative land management, we could sequester all the carbon we need to cool the environment, restore biodiversity, provide meaningful employment, and feed everyone nutrient-dense food. There's your universal healthcare. So to build a resilient local food economy, here's some ideas that we might use going forward. Establish price parity for farm products to ensure farmers and farm workers can earn a living wage. Institute regional supply management of farm products to keep farm pricing fair for small farmers. Establish cooperative markets and food processing hubs. Welcome migrant farm workers and ensure they receive equal rights and justice. Regenerative land management can cool the planet, restore biodiversity, and save humanity. But for any of that to happen, we need to understand that soil is the matrix of life, and as such, is the very essence of the commons. We need a healthy Soils Protection and Restoration Act to provide farmers with the training and incentives they need to transition to regenerative practices. We must not only reward farmers for ecological services, such as growing nutrient-dense food, providing cleaner air and water, and sequestering carbon. We need a holistic measure of ecological services. Land managers who are capable of growing topsoil while providing food, fuel, medicine, and fiber must be justly compensated the same way that civil society supports all other basic infrastructure and service providers. The novel coronavirus is telling us many things. One clear message is that this global pandemic has the same root causes as abrupt climate change. We have created this situation through land degradation and loss of habitat. The predictable, tragic outcomes of unfettered capitalism that commodifies nature and externalizes environmental costs. On the other side of all this death and suffering, collapse of the global economy, we have before us a watershed moment for change on an unprecedented scale. Just as in the Great Depression, the federal government will act to save our economy. We must be ready to lift our collective voices to ensure that change comes in the form of a Green New Deal, which recognizes habitat restoration as the basis of true societal wealth. It takes two wings to fly. We need to practice an engaged regenerative land management that equally prioritizes nonviolent direct action and hands in the ground practice. All right, well, thanks for listening to that, everybody. That's my kind of regenerative agriculture version of the Extinction Rebellion talk, with the difference being that the most hopeful message that you get out of Extinction Rebellion, God bless everyone's soul who's in there, and I'm one of them, is that we're going to transition off of fossil fuels to a new type of regenerative energy system, but without really yet embracing the vision of the land and the hopeful message that's here right under our feet. And so that's part of my mission, is to try to bring to the climate justice movement this really hopeful message in the midst of the agri-apocalypse and the larger calamities we face, that the solutions really are within reach. They're as close as the ground beneath our feet, and making sure that everyone who wants it has access to it. So I could keep going, or if anybody has anything they want to add at this point, that would be great too. I'm going to move into a next phase, which is more talking about how we're implementing some of these practices at Cedar Mountain Farm.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Who is that?
This is John Pimentel.
Okay.
Steve, I'm wondering how much penetration into the farm world is regenerative practices getting? You know, I've heard it discussed for a couple of years, but I don't have any idea of how much it's penetrated the actual farm world.
The actual farm world, that's great. That's a great question, because it's definitely getting into the cultural zeitgeist. But I would say that we're still a tiny percentage of the acreage in the United States and North America of farmland is being farmed in a truly regenerative way. But I think that the really hopeful signs are how much even the USDA and NRCS and other government agencies that work with training farmers, getting technical access to farmers and farmer-to-farmer training, are really beginning to promote these messages in a surprisingly bold way, and a way that's beginning to get government helping to get access to the technical training to make this transition. So that's what I see as a potential to. We need to build it out and magnify it by many tens of the power, those efforts. But I do see them beginning to be discussed in pretty much the mainstream land grant and NRCS circles.
How about here in, I have one follow-up. How about here in Vermont, Stephen? Is there much penetration in Vermont?
So I think our local food movement, the CSA movement, is very much catching on to regenerative organic practice, and beginning to transition out of just what I would call traditional organic practice, which can be rather tillage intensive and therefore counterproductive to the goal of healthy soil. But I think that the information is awash right now, and people are really hearing this message and really getting it in the organic movement. And it's making small inroads into the conventional in the form of the tiny steps of going to no-till and to cover cropping. And so we can see those as first inroads into conventional agriculture, when they begin to adopt those practices, I think there's really hope that with proper incentive, they could be leveraged then to take it further. And that would be particularly the dairy industry in Vermont.
Does anyone have any more questions for Steve? Great, Steve, you want to go ahead and go into the next segment?
So, so those are my kind of formal presentation. I just wanted to more talk with you person to person about how we're implementing some of those. I mentioned the 5 principles that were originally promoted by the NRCS, the National Resources Conservation Service, which is the government agency that grew out of the original Soil Conservation Service, which was instituted under the FDR administration during the Dust Bowl years in the Great Depression. So the NRCS came up with these 4 principles or 5 principles, depending on who you talk to, that are, you know, all about practices to promote healthy soil. And one of the main ones is minimize soil disturbance. And and as I was talking about it when I referred to traditional organic practice, so I've been, I started farming when I was 31 years old, as I mentioned, in 1992 as a biodynamic farm apprentice at Hawthorne Valley Farm in upstate New York. And I was there for 3 years. And so that was kind of cutting edge organic plus, because we were also doing the somewhat mystical practices indicated by Rudolf Steiner of biodynamic preparations and all of that sort of intuitive science farming that goes with the biodynamic movement. And but even so, we were plowing annually. We were using rototillers in the market garden. We were doing intensive tillage of our row crops in the market garden and of our row crops for corn, for cow feed. And so a lot of soil disturbance, in some ways even more than some of our conventional neighbors, because we needed to do an extra amount of cultivating to deal with weed pressure, which they would take care of by chemical means, chemical, you know, herbicide suppressants. So my whole question through 30 years of farming, is there such a thing as sustainable farming? And my mentor getting involved with Cobb Hill was Dana Meadows, Donella Meadows of Limits to Growth fame. And we talked about that a lot. Is there, through the 10,000 years of human history, are there examples where people were able to actually build soil as they gained their sustenance? I think certainly the people that lived in our region before European settlement happened demonstrated that it clearly is possible. But we thought organic farming was the way, but we were really based on this whole idea still of inputs, which is the whole conventional agriculture approach, that you're going to bring in everything you need to grow plants, and the soil is basically the medium that's going to deliver that stuff, rather than seeing the soil as this living house. So by understanding the new soil microbiology, what we understand then is that all of these living organisms, that from the most minute to the macro level of voles and earthworms and large fauna and flora, that all of it is basically this house. And the keystone species that helps build this house is the mycorrhizae and also the saprophytic fungi, that they are the foundation of this house, and they help build this house. And every time and then it creates habitat, air, water, space, places for all this incredible web of life to exist and to aggregate soil and build soil. And every time we come through with a plow or a rotavator or a spader, we basically demolish the house. It's like coming through with a tornado and a hurricane and an earthquake all at once, the effects it has on the life of the soil. And 90% of the living beings on the terrestrial planet live in the soil. And so on my market garden here, it's about 1.25 acre. On 1 acre of that market garden, there's the equivalent living in the soil of 20 cows. That much tonnage of fungi and bacteria and all the other associated flora and fauna with them. So how do we farm in a way that doesn't demolish the house, but rather helps build the house? So here's me doing my organic horse-powered farmer thing and loving it, but plowing in my cover crops and cultivating my brassica crop. So a lot of soil disturbance. This is a Singing Frogs farm out in Sebastopol, California, along with Dan Mays of Frith Farm up in Maine, and what's his name? Brian O'Hara at Tobacco Road Farm in Connecticut. These are some of the pioneers of no-till market gardening, where we're moving towards zero disturbance of the soil with permanent no-till beds. So here's a picture of our high tunnel. And here I brought in 25 wheelbarrows per bed of finished compost, laid it on really thick. And then you can see this is midsummer. That's my wife, Carrie, go out harvesting out of the high tunnel. Super productive and very low weeds. We have this on drip, but we also do some overhead in here. Here's a kind of a Hygge Kultur experiment I did. So the hoop house was the first thing I tried. Then I went outside and right on some lawn, I started building beds, and I built 4 16-foot long beds, and I planted them to Three Sisters polyculture. And here you can see just a couple of weeks ago, the corn, and so we got a real wonderful little climate in there. Some of my first mentors in farming were Felipe and Elena Ishkat, who were Mayan Mum people who lived in public sanctuary at the Weston Priory in Weston, Vermont. And I lived there at the time too, back in the 80s and early 90s. And I learned, they were my first real garden mentors, and they taught me this polyculture, which was a lot more than corn, squash, and beans, but they were able to adapt that to the Green Mountains in an incredible way. So here I'm using the horses to form my first permanent beds out in the market garden. So I'm using the old cultivator to make some kind of like raised beds, and then I'm taking the old horse-drawn manure spreader and putting as much compost on a single 140-foot bed as I used to put on a 1/4 acre of market garden. It's like 5 yards or more, laying on this really thick mulch, 4 to 5 inches thick. And then here's another section that was a buckwheat cover crop. And this young fellow who was working for us here, once we got, I tilled in that cover crop with, sort of regular tillage tools with my horses, and then we established these beds. And then he's using a tool called a broad fork, which is like a hand tool subsoiler. So it's kind of a minimal disturbance, but recognizing that we have some plow pan from our use of the tillage tools over 20 years, we're using the broad fork to open up these beds. Really serious workout though. That guy is not going to need to go to the gym. And so here's some of the raised beds that we're making that have been broad forked, and then you see them on the right with the compost spread. And then we're using wood chips for the paths, and we get the wood chips from the crews that do the clearing of the power lines. They're willing to just drop them off if you have an easy access spot on your property. And so the wood chips are really going to be bringing in the fungi as well. So the idea here is that this market garden is on a piece of land that was an old growth forest, probably 200 years ago. It's probably been farmed continuously since then. We find oxen shoes and old horse-drawn hames from a century ago come popping up out of the soil. So this was an old growth forest, and some old growth forests really were a lot deeper than a foot of soil. Even in Vermont, there was some very productive old growth forests that really built soil, and on top of that they'd have like another 6 to 8 inches of duff, just digesting leaves and mosses and sticks and everything, just totally protected, covered soil that was building up since the glaciers retreated 12,000 years ago. So basically what we're doing is we're bringing in a lot of forest products to recreate the humus of the forest floor. So because we're a small dairy farm, we have our own ample supply of really good finished compost, and we make that in our bedded pack barn, which you can see on the right. So we're bringing in sawdust as bedding all winter long for the cows, and just letting that build up and compost right in the barn. And then we bring that out and turn it a few more times out on the stacking pad. So that's a lot of forest products mixed with the prime material of the premier ruminant, our dairy cows, and that's going on the beds as a finished product. And then we're loading up these ramial wood chips into the pathways. So basically mulching out weed pressure and just building up this really beautiful protective cover for the soil. And you can see we're doing some multi-cropping. We've got carrots and beans growing in one picture, trying a lot of things like that. And then doing a lot of successions. When one crop is done, we have transplants in the crop tunnel ready to come out, so that we're trying to do that thing too of maximizing the photosynthesis, because that's really what feeds the microbiology. That's it. That's what feeds the planet, right? Plants performing their miracle, both on land and in the sea. So here we did some solarization where we had a cover crop. I had land that this year was in turf. It had been this winter grazing for horses, and I plowed it down and just did harrowed all that and put in some oats and peas early spring, and then we mowed the oats and peas with the horses and used some old greenhouse plastic to solarize the mown oats and everything else that survived the plowing. And this is what we've got now. This was just a couple of weeks ago. This is our fall brassica, and so that just in the spring was still sod. And there you can see we've got a really booming crop of brassica going there. And then here's a little shot of the onions midsummer with some mushrooms sprouting up in the garden. As a shot of the onion harvest. You can see we're pulling onions, very few weeds in the bed. And I should say that weed pressure and dealing with weed pressure is usually one of our biggest labor demands in the market garden. And here's another shot looking out on that same section with the brassica, some chard and beets in the foreground. And there's an overview midsummer of the market garden as it was developing, transitioning to no-till. And in addition to the market garden, of course, one of our major endeavors is that we're milking 24 cows. We've got a couple of Holsteins that my daughter shows in 4-H, but everybody else is a Jersey cow. And you can see them up on the hill pastures on one of these photos, and then on what would be so-called tillable acres down below here. And you can see on these tillable acres some of the forage growth that we're getting, even in this really droughty summer. Particularly the first half of the summer was terrible drought here. We've got a foot of forage there. You can barely see the grazing stick. This is a tool for measuring height and density, so you can estimate how much feed you have for your cows per inch per acre. That kind of shows the grazing line where the cows were and where they're going to be. And there's the cows up on the hill pastures. And I'm hoping to get our hill pastures to be as abundant as that. And that's a work in progress. We're moving the cows every 24 hours. So we're really trying to extend the rest periods that the land gets. We only make first cut hay on our hay fields and have them all fenced with high tensile fencing, so we can extend our grazing period at the end of the summer by having the cows go and take the second cut, third cut off of those hay fields instead of using the tractors and the horses. So that's what I have for photos. I guess I'll see if I can fun to be able to share a little bit of what we're actually doing on the ground.
Yeah, that was great. It was really great to see firsthand and see the transition. And so this is your first year doing that, Stephen?
Yeah, it's the very first year doing no-till. We have 1.25 acres under no-till, and that I think is all that we're going to do. But I didn't expect to go that far with it this year. I thought, we'll try out 1/4 acre, but we ended up because we have some COVID refugee college students. We actually ended up with a really good crew this year, and so it just seemed like, hey, let's go for it. We got some good people here. I think we can make this get this done. And hopefully the setup here is going to be the most labor intensive. Like today I was just re-prepping onion beds so that we could get some mixed cover crop on there that'll winter kill of oats and crimson clover and peas. And so I was using the horses to spread those beds, and I found that 2 passes was really sufficient to get a good cover for next year, whereas you know, in the spring I was using 5 passes with the spreader, which is basically 5 yards of compost. So already seeing it using a much less to maintain the beds than it took to establish them. Now we're still doing a good amount of weeding, but nothing. It's got to be like 85% reduction weed pressure compared to what we used to deal with. So
Wow.
and hopefully, you know, the more we can keep weeds from growing the seed in the garden, we'll just keep reducing that as we go along.
So stepping back a little bit, I mean, you're talking about your practices as a farmer, but you know, for most people who aren't farmers or maybe just gardeners, but also who are concerned about climate change and who are part of the movement, how can we work to, well, how can like consumers help the transition and help the movement? Or how can people who are already kind of involved support this transition, support farmers and farming this way more?
Wow, that's such a great question. I think maybe I'll think about 2 parts to that. I think one thing is, one of the wonderful things about regenerative land management is that it extends beyond the farm. It extends to the forest, and extends to anybody who has tenure over any piece of land whatsoever, no matter how small it is. I like to think that no piece of land is too insignificant to be, you know, worthy of restoration and protection and regeneration and soil building practices. So really, in particular, homeowners and people who maintain lawns and or small woodlots can really be doing a lot to enhance, foster the life of the soils of the land that they have. And unfortunately, also a lot of glyphosate and nicotinoids and NPK and things like this are being used in lawn care, even in Vermont. And you know, even a lot of the property maintenance companies that people with second homes or small businesses hire to maintain their properties will be using these kinds of biocides. So there's so much we can do, even just beginning with homeowners or renters who have any land whatsoever that they're responsible for, to get this message that they can be empowered to help restore that land, that they can get their hands and feet right into it. And also participating in municipal composting or composting on the home site is a really important part of this too. I mean, it's really shocking how much methane is released through food that goes into the waste stream and into the landfills. So, but then, you know, clearly getting to know who your local farmers are and learning what their practices are and supporting those ones who are embracing regenerative practices. And maybe even trying to nudge along the ones, you know, to be more interested in your products if you were thinking about this or that, you know. But then I think our next steps are also to look to policymakers to begin to prioritize regenerative land practices and to begin to incentivize the people who are capable of managing land and wanting to make a career path out of it, whether it be forestry or ranching, farming or market gardening. And so I think supporting policy, supporting lawmakers who are talking about that, you know, listening to people like David Zuckerman and Heather Supernon from Barnard, excuse me, who just got the nomination to be a rep for Windsor County in that district. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple more questions, but I want to open it up to everyone else first. We want to spend the some time talking about, you know, I want you to ask Stephen questions, but also I want to encourage everyone to kind of engage in a discussion about regenerative ag and what we can do to build the movement, and what we can do at the policy level, and how we can support our farmers. So does anyone have any comments, questions, thoughts they want to share?
I have a question. Stephen, well, Jael knows that one of the reasons that I'm interested in this is that I'm trying to put together a play for the kids at our elementary school in Worcester to do, that has to do with, well, that would include regenerative agriculture as a part of it. And I'm wondering what, I was trying to take notes, but I couldn't begin. What would be a good resource for me to understand the basics of soil science and the living components of the soil that we want to be trying to take care of?
So resources particularly geared towards that?
Yeah,
Yep.
so
Yeah.
information, you know, the basic information, which I don't have in my brain. This was not
Yeah.
something we taught,
So
but I'd love.
For you, on an adult level, I'd go to the ATTRA, ATTRA website.
ATTRA, okay.
And they're associated with, they do work with NRCS, but they're an NGO, and they have an incredible website that gives all kinds of primers on the basics of soil health and the soil health principles. And then, you know, an array of speakers that you can listen to talks on it if you want to dig deeper. But yeah, that would be a great source. Now, locally, the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition is a great resource. Kat Buxton and Dee Dee Pershaus are involved there, as well as Jael.
Okay.
So she can hook you up with, they have some great resources available as well.
Okay.
And they're doing some really great work with farm to school, so you might even be able to
Okay.
plug into some really great models of what they're doing.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. That sounds like a wonderful project. Really great. I mean, that's where it has to begin, right? We need to get.
It feels really
schools.
important to start
Yeah.
getting this into the schools, basically.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I agree, and I think it's like we have to go beyond just farm to school, where kids just have an experience of where the food comes from, to really re-incentivizing regenerative farming, so that it actually is something where a school guidance counselor is going to see a really bright kid who's got practical skills and energy and math skills and science skills and language skills, and say, hey, I think you could have a great career path in farming.
Yeah.
But we have to make it so that they can, right? Because what is more important for this next generation than healthy soils and a healthy planet and a restored biosphere? And we need to get them the access to the tools they need to understand that and put it into play, you know, bring it into fruition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Yes. Hi, Stephen. This is John again. Beyond the legislature, are there any farm associations that are trying to boost regenerative farming?
Well, certainly, No for Vermont and Rural Vermont are both great promoters of not only organic but regenerative practices. Yeah. Beyond that, I can't think of any organization in the state that's really promoting the regenerative model in the way that those two organizations are, and they've done a lot of work on policy as well.
Are they actually reaching out to farmers to try to bring them the resources that they may need to transition to no-till farming?
No, I think they want to. They're trying, but I think that's a really hard ask, and it's uh, I feel like it's through the land grant college through UVM and NRCS that we need to begin really insisting that this is the kind of practices that need to be incentivized going forward. I would say to UVM's great credit, they are the only land grant college in the United States that actually has a department dealing with the impacts of climate change on agriculture in our region. And there's certainly through that lens and reaching out to farmers through that lens, promoting practices that bring essentially our healthy soil practices and pitching it to farmers in terms of this is what's going to allow you to be resilient through rain events and mini droughts and all the other erratic weather patterns that we're experiencing now as farmers in the state.
Thanks.
John, as just as one citizen and one farmer, I made it my mission to become a healthy soil advocate and do everything I can to take opportunities like I was presented with tonight to just speak about these issues.
I have a question. First, thank you so much for this presentation. It's been really interesting and important. I live up in Burlington, and I'm just wondering for us city folk who really are interested in using our consumer practices to support this, how would we go about finding which farms in our area are doing regenerative ag, and is that something we would usually find only at farmers markets or at grocery stores too? Or, are there certain grocery stores that are doing this better? Is there labeling? Lots of questions, but just we really want to know how to buy better.
We may have lost him. Well, I can, so there is a national label that just came, that the Rodale Institute just released. I don't know if it's going to make its way to Vermont, but I think that,
I see, I lost sound.
Stephen, are you there? I think he's, Stephen?
Oh, I see what I need to do.
It's okay. I think that going.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, sorry about that. Hope I wasn't gone too long.
No, did you hear Laura's question?
No, I didn't.
Laura, you want to ask it again?
Sure, yeah. First, just thanking you for the presentation. And I live up in Burlington, so I'm wondering about how consumers, and there are a lot of us that are interested in this, how do we find out which farms in our area are practicing regenerative ag? And I asked about labeling and whether it's better to buy at farmers markets or if there are any grocery chains or co-ops that are doing this well. Basically I go to the store and I can't tell by the labels. And so I want to know how to do better.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I agree that in regards to labeling in the stores, it is a very confusing situation. I think that we can still trust that organic generally is better than conventional, even when it's from large national chains. And as far as regenerative labeling, for me as a farmer, we're actually not a certified farm. And even if there is a regenerative label, I don't think we're going to embrace it. But we're a really small farm and we're trying to sell everything. Some of our cheese goes to larger distribution, but all our market garden products are sold within 10 miles of the farm. And that's really what the type of agriculture we're trying to promote. And we feel like when we do that, we're customer certified. If we're making it and if we're selling our products, it's because people know about us and they trust us, and they think this food is going to be healthy food for them. So, but I understand if you're living in a more urban area that being connected to a farm right in your town might not be as possible. Certainly, both NOFA Vermont puts out a really extensive guide to all the CSA farms in the state and all the farmers markets in the state. So they have a lot of, and rural Vermont, I think, also has similar or works on the same resources with them. And NOFA publishes a guide every year as well that if you're a member, they'll send to you, but you can probably get off their website. I think they're probably the greatest resource in the state for, you know, organic doesn't necessarily mean regenerative, and that's something that we're working on, but we certainly wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't be knocking organic farming in any way, shape, or form. It's, you know, even if it's organic farming that is based on what they're not doing instead of what they are doing, it's still great that they're not doing those things that allows them to be certified. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with, did you say NOFA?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont.
Thank you.
And Laura, if you contact them, you could ask them if they can connect you with a regenerative ag organic farm near Burlington. And they're based in Richmond, so not too far from Burlington area. And, you know, maybe if they hear from more people, they'll start to list regenerative ag farms as well as organic, or have some sort of designation for those farms.
Great, thank you.
Does anyone else have a comment or a question or an idea or anything they want to share?
Jael and Steve, I was wondering, we're sort of in the process of massive unlawning in our yard, and we have a number of raised beds and no grass any longer and lots of wood chips. But is there a fairly user-friendly guide? Where would we look for a fairly user-friendly guide for doing no-till in raised beds? Is that a small-scale raised beds? You know, I've seen Kat Buxton and seen her description of that. Is there a particular resource you would send me to?
Yeah.
Would tell us a little more about how to do that successfully in these raised beds?
Do you, are you comfortable with watching YouTube videos?
Yep. Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
There's a delightful English gardener named Charles Dowding.
Okay.
So his first name is Charles, his last name is Dowding, Dowding.
Uh-huh.
And Charles was a larger scale commercial farmer at one point, but he has scaled down to about a 1/4 acre of no-till organic vegetable production. And he's a true master of it, and he's a delightful person. I find it soothing just to spend 10 or 15 minutes with him on one of his vids. It's kind of like the Mr. Rogers of the no-till farming world.
Oh, thank you. That's worth it on 2 levels. So thank you. Yeah.
All right, you're very welcome.
Hi, Steve. This is John. I've got another question.
All right.
I'm sure you've heard of the Real Organic project.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, you know, could sustainable agriculture, could a similar NGO approach work where farms could be, you know, certified by this non-governmental organization as a regenerative farm, similar to what they're doing with the Real Organic project?
Yeah, I think, John, there's something in the works out of the Rodale Institute to do just what you're talking about. So they are coming up with a regenerative criteria, and that could lead to a certifying body out of. You're familiar with the Rodale Institute in PA?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So they've got something in the works along those lines.
All right, that's pretty exciting news.
Yeah, it is, because they're certainly they've been their research on row crop no-tilling with the rowa crimpers has been really revolutionary, and it's beginning to. And I'm not sure if you know what I'm referring to, but for the row crops like corn and soy that they're using glyphosate no-till systems, there are ways that the cover crops can be terminated by physical means with a thing called a rower crimper, and Rodale was really instrumental in the first trials with the roller crimper, getting that off the ground and proving that it could be as effective as the herbicides. So they're doing great work there.
I am familiar with that, but I haven't seen it implemented yet.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anybody up in Vermont. That's be a good question to find out if there are any farms having success with it up here in Vermont.
And I also wanted to say thanks, Steve, for taking part in this. This has been a really informative presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks.
I just wanted to add one more thing about, you know, as a consumer purchasing, if you do consume meat, purchasing meat that is grass-based, because that, they may not be actually regenerative, but a grass-based system is much more regenerative than when animals are fed corn or silage. So if you can afford it and you have access to it, getting your meat that's raised on grass is the best way. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Stephen. And then,
yeah, so like on our farm, we raise all our bull calves as steers, so they end up being grass-fed, not 100% grass-fed beef, but they're raised through our intensive management grazing practices, and we are able to sell all that beef right out of our farm stand, just locally. A little bit goes to the Harpoon Brewery, which has an outdoor beer garden where they serve hamburgers, but otherwise it's just all moving right from the farm. You know, as I was talking about, our market garden and our pastures all used to be under old growth forest. That's what Vermont wants to be. It wants to be this incredible patchwork of diverse old growth forests that acclimated from swamp to mountaintop across and formed this living continuous mantle of forest that was here. So it's what we've done in creating grasslands is completely unnatural to this region. But now that we have them, they are an incredible resource, and they can become carbon sinks if managed appropriately. It's not the same as regenerative management of natural grasslands like out in Iowa or Nebraska or the Dakotas, but nonetheless, many of our hill farms are unsuitable to row crops or vegetable production. So short of setting them back to forest, regeneratively managing them through intensive grazing practices is a tremendous opportunity for us. And we could be raising all of our beef and all of our hogs and all of our chickens right here in the state if we were to transition the larger farms to a more diversified profile of mixed pastures with row crops. Giles, that's the last thing that I wanted to add was what you and I began talking about, which was ways that we can be sure to, both as activists and soil advocates and aware, citizens participating in democracy, really being aware that if we get a change of administration, there will be green stimulus money coming from the federal government to try to salvage the economy. And we really need to make sure that our legislators are aware of healthy soil, not only as important for a sovereign relocalized food system, but also as a major component of climate change mitigation. And I think that we have a lot of great allies in the State House, but they need to hear this from more citizens, the importance of a transition, an immediate, just transition of our agriculture to regenerative practices as part of a response to abrupt climate change and loss of biodiversity.
Will you talk a little more about what you mean by just transition and what that would look like?
So yeah, I don't really have the answers, but it seems to me that dairy farmers are and other conventional farmers are all, for the most part, really good people and people who want to do right by their land, but they've been struggling against the odds for so many years now with national milk prices that have left them getting deeper and deeper into debt. And right now Vermont produces 1% of the national milk supply. So if we stopped milking cows in Vermont tomorrow, nobody would notice because we actually have this surplus of milk. And the farmers are getting about $10.98 a hundredweight, which is almost $10 less than they were getting last year. In 1905, they were getting $5 a hundredweight, so they're only getting twice what they got in what their grandparents got in 1905. So, and people who are farming under debt, who have kind of gotten into a system where they have all these expensive inputs, but they rely on them to keep their crops and cattle growing. They're totally risk averse. So how do we convince those people that it's worth taking the risk to transition to regenerative practices? Well, the way we're going to do it is by offering them a pathway. And that's got to come through technical assistance. It's got to come through incentives. It's got to come through payments for ecological services. It's got to come through farmer-to-farmer training. And so we really need to beef up the resources available to incentivize these farmers. And so just backing up a little bit, how does that happen? When I wrote a couple of books on farming with horses a few years back for Chelsea Green, and in the course of research, I visited Amish communities, and the Amish are, of course, the old order Amish and Mennonites are still farming with horses and still farming fairly small, diversified farms. But even so, their population is still growing. There are 250,000 Amish in North America, and they're still having large families. So they need to either divide their farms up, or they need to do out-migration. So a lot of small groups of Amish families, 5 or 6 or 10 families, will go to buy up a bunch of land where it's really cheap out in central Michigan or northern Maine, places that are being abandoned by conventional agriculture. And once they get established, because of the way they work, the low cost, low input, fairly regenerative practices that they often put into place, they succeed where other farmers couldn't. And all of a sudden, there's mom and pop stores that grow up around them. There's repair stores that start to come in. More families come. More land is converted back to farm. And you see this multiplier effect that leads to a healthy, renewed agrarian economy. And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of like farming as a pathway. Many more farms. We need many, many more farmers if we're going to, because that's one thing about regenerative land management. It works better to human scale. It requires more human labor. So we need to make it so that we pay for the real price of food and the real, and we stop discounting the externalized costs of conventional farming, and make sure that anybody who can produce healthy soil while producing food, fuel, fiber, or medicine is able to make a living wage at it. And I think part of a just transition also has to account for the climate refugees who are here. Many of those climate refugees are working on our dairy farms. We call them migrant workers. They've fled the highlands of Guatemala, Central America, because climate change is causing drought where they come from. There'll be many more coming. Of course, there are also 1%er, very rich climate refugees and COVID refugees coming at the same time. So how do we create partnerships between NGOs, government and business to start to free up some of the land so that we're not doing eco-socialist land reform, but incentivizing landowners to convert to regenerative land management forestry-wise and open up access to agricultural acres to new farmers, migrant farmers, young women farmers, people of color, et cetera, et cetera. So a kind of progressive land reform. So sorry about that long riff, but I get carried away sometimes.
Well, and it seems to me, I remember when NAFTA first went through, and that sort of shifted the whole agricultural system in Mexico.
Correct.
And so that kind of thing needs, in other places, we need to turn things back around as well.
That's so true, Del. That's a great point. In two significant ways, NAFTA affected particularly the indigenous populations of Mexico. The first was that the indigenous people had a reservation system called the ejido system. But unlike the reservations here, since the revolution in 1820, it was illegal for the ejidos, for the indigenous people, to sell or lease indigenous land. So it was, even up into the late 20th century, all of the ejido land was still in the hands of indigenous people. And so they were growing crops in Mexico, you know, for export or for export out of their region, like, you know, oranges or clementines or any number of things, coffee, you name it. There's so many different regions, agricultural regions in Mexico, but they were making a living as farmers. And Mexico was corn self-sufficient. So NAFTA did a few things. It said one of the things they forced the Mexican government to do was change the ejido system. So suddenly people could be coerced into renting or leasing to multinationals from North America to give up some of their agricultural land. And number two, they introduced GMO corn into Mexico and began to destroy all these microclimate corns that had evolved over, people had evolved over, you know, millennia. And they forced Mexico to import a certain percentage of corn as well, so that this nation that was corn self-sufficient was suddenly displacing the corn farmers who were then coming north to work on the farms up here. And we know the rest is history as far as the way those people have been treated since they were forced off their land.
Yeah.
So you're right. We need to, and so this gets into how with Biden-Harris, we're not going to accept business as usual post-COVID world of going back to neoliberal free trade agreements that hurt small farmers and contaminate land and promote agribusiness worldwide. You're right. We need to protect the sovereignty, food sovereignty of other people by making sure our policies don't destroy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a significant contributor to climate change as well, when those small indigenous farmers are displaced by monocropping agro exporters.
So what could we do kind of at the Vermont scale or in Vermont to address some of these issues? In terms of
one of the things that I've been talking with some of the legislators on this side of the state about is a Vermont Healthy Soils Act. So we have 5 states that have passed something like this. New Mexico and California have really functional exemplary programs. Though I understand now California is being cut with the budget crisis associated with COVID and the wildfires in California right now, which is really unfortunate because it's getting at the root causes of those problems to promote healthy soils. But people aren't seeing that enough. But California has a Healthy Soils Act, which really builds out on programs that were already in place, but shifts a lot more resources to promoting, incentivizing practices for vineyards, farmers, ranchers, and foresters around the state of California to adopt healthy soil practices. And so, you know, what I said about conventional farmers being risk averse, they're helping create that transition, creating those bridges for people to begin to implement these practices, doing things like cost sharing on compost or beginning to establish measures for ecological services of water infiltration, protection, cleaning, and measurements of building, of how soil organic matter is being built on these farms, and for carbon sequestration. So I would really like to see Vermont, whatever Vermont Green New Deal or Vermont stimulus package that comes forward in 2021, I really want it to be framed in some manner, shape, or form around a healthy soils protection and restoration. And that includes not only the incentives for building the living soil, but also all the social changes that we've been discussing that allow that to happen, and incentivize people who and gain skills, access to training for people who want to do that work. Creating markets, ideas like creating a Vermont brand milk. So we only produce enough milk that the state of Vermont needs, but the state pitches in and helps, and we have processing plants and hubs throughout the state for producing dairy products for local consumption, for instance. All kinds of food hubs that we could be establishing, making sure that everyone who wants to raise and slaughter animals has access to getting their animals processed in mobile slaughterhouses that could move all around the state and facilitate that. That's a real problem right now, the backup in the few packing houses that we have. Things of that nature, like real practical policy steps that we could take to incentivize kind of farming in the state. And then, but I think, we're really going to be needing to look to the federal government with some kind of Green New Deal as well. That ideas that I talked about that came out of the original New Deal. We know that a lot of people got left behind in the New Deal, so we're not like trying to replicate it. Saying here was some of the basic parameters that they set, like establishing price parity for farmers, so that if in my region I can't sell my Brussels sprouts for what I need to get a living wage for them, there will be, if I'm doing that in following regenerative practices, there will be stimulus money to make sure that my costs are covered beyond what the free market system is able to provide. That's the thing that I think we were talking about with Dell as well, that we need to extricate ourselves from seeing farming as being subject just to the unfettered free market capitalist system. And I know this is a social democratic idea, but if we recognize soil as basic infrastructure, then it is the duty of government, who has sworn to protect us and keep us safe, to protect our soils. And the way we protect our soils is by supporting our farmers, ranchers, and foresters to do that work. So if the free market capitalist system is not providing farmers with the living wage they need to do the work, then government needs to step in and find other ways to incentivize and support that through maybe progressive taxation, getting the 1% to do more to protect the environment. As we transition from fossil fuels, getting the fossil fuel companies to begin to pay some reparations for damages, and having some of that money go to green stimulus for regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of different ways we can talk about the money. Anthony Polina had a really great idea in the state of Vermont for his Green New Deal of taxing 5% of the Trump tax cuts that Vermonters received, taxing just 5% of those Vermont tax cut payments that I think 15,000 very wealthy people in Vermont received, would gain us, I think he said, on the order of $3.5 million a year for 5 years to move forward a Vermont Green New Deal. So that was just one really creative, I thought quite creative idea that was out there for a progressive taxation system to help promote regenerative farming.
Yeah, we worked a lot on trying to get that bill passed and out of committee. I have one more question, but does anyone else have something else they want to ask or add? So you touched on this a little bit. Oh,
Theo
go ahead.
has a question.
Go ahead,
Theo's been
Theo.
trying to raise
Hi, gang. Yeah, I mean, I was wondering, I've been thinking about this as sort of like a rescue mission for the planet. Like, if we ever, finally turn a corner and get a government on our side, like, how could this kind of thinking be sort of immediate, emergency step? We know it's California's 120 degrees right now. So I just feel like what we've talked about tonight is central to the vision of climate activists everywhere. We should include this in our rhetoric, being like, not only do we want to cut subsidies to oil companies, but also to John Deere tractors who are tilling everything, subsidized agriculture. Just to make a link, all those beautiful bacteria we talk about, like when I heard fracking activist Steingraber talk about how in this fracking wells, all these beautiful bacteria are working away. They actually have to pump like toxic waste down into the frack holes because pretty much they'll close up. The little microbes will eat everything. So it's a living planet we're on. It's like a walking compost pile, and we're lucky to have all these bacteria working for us. And just appreciating the knowledge tonight, and maybe. If you could imagine like a rescue mission using agriculture, what would it be?
Rescue mission. I think one thing that I'd really love to see would be a youth soil regeneration corps, so that young people, instead of taking a gap year, could be paid to go out and do riparian buffer zones and help farmers plant alley cropping systems through their row crops, plant trees, and really engage youth in regenerative creative practices, and so that they get a hands-on education of the value of these concepts. And I think getting this stuff into the school curriculum at an early age is really important too. So that's another thing I think we can really hammer on. And I really agree with you, Theo, about what's the right word? Spreading the message in the climate justice movement, so that Extinction Rebellion, 350.org, Sunrise Movement, everybody really gets this message that that there is a really positive story to tell, as well as the cat. I don't need to refer to the tidal wave we're facing, the rogue waves and the tidal waves that are coming down on us that are already here. But there is a positive message, and I think that's really critical. And it has to do with not only is regenerative farming important for food security, you can hook a lot of people with that because that's important, right? When COVID first struck and there was a lot of uncertainty about food supply chains and we saw the vulnerabilities, that got a lot of people's attention. So that's an important hook, but we don't want to just work on fear, right? We have this positive vision of a repaired environment and how people can participate in that. We've been convinced that we're consumers, right? My parents' generation were citizens, but our generation, we've been convinced that we're consumers. So I think this is really about turning the page to where we understand ourselves as producers, and participating in the carbon cycle as producers. So basically what we're talking about is ecological enlightenment. That's what's going to save us as a species if we're going to be worthy of being saved, right? But how do we get there? And we get there through, I think, ecological literacy. And ecological literacy has to be practical. It has to be practiced. It has to be seen, right? You have to get the people through their senses and and expose children to this. And so I don't have any quick, clear answers about how do we create a revolution and a movement out of this, but I've joined Extinction Rebellion and working with a lot of folks in 350, and I just see myself as having this mission to talk to everybody in the climate justice movement I possibly can about the importance of regenerative land management. And basically, no matter what technological fixes we come up with, right? Even if they're able to figure out how to suck carbon out of the sky and pump it, 50 miles under the earth and all these, put mirrors up into this space and everything that they're talking about, bioengineering. If we don't repair our relationship to the living systems and understand ourselves as completely enmeshed in the web of life, then there's no point in the technological fixes, right? That's our path forward. Biomimicry is the new science. And it's such an exciting science. We really got to get people excited and kids excited about it, because it's such an exciting science. I mean, there's nothing we can't make. Even we can make anything out of natural systems. Any plastic that we feel like utterly dependent on, it can be made out of polymers and be digested by microbes. We just haven't been, because it's so cheap to do all this stuff with oil, we've just been on such a high on this oil stuff. But we start applying this incredible science we've developed over the last 150 years to biomimicry. There's no limit to what we could do as a planet and thrive, but anyway.
Well, I think that's a fantastic place to end, and a lot to think about. I do want to say that we want to continue this discussion, spend more time, and we want to host another webinar in October and probably invite Stephen back and a few other folks and really engage in a discussion about how we can do this at the policy level, and just build the movement around these concepts and around healthy soils. So I will let you all know when that happens. But Stephen, thank you so much. It was very informative, and I love how just all your ideas and everything you talked about.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be invited. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and hopefully we can all work together more and get 350 Vermont and Extinction Rebellion working more arm in arm. So I just want to make sure I'm not leaving anyone out if there's one more or two more comments, but if not, then we'll say good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Great.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right.
Hi, Jael.
Hi, bye, Del.
How are you doing?
Good.
How are you doing? You doing okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good.